Today is Tuesday, May 19th, 2026, and this is Read Through the Bible.
Hi, everyone.
And this is the afternoon.
This is our recap edition of 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, and so you were reading something in your Bible that just the ESV has like a heading about what 1 Corinthians is about. I think that's a good way to introduce and talk about 1 Corinthians. That's what we want to do this next 15 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, so kind of midway through the introduction here, it says, the church that Paul planted in Corinth in Acts 18 floundered under all of the influences around them in Corinth and began to divide over various issues. 1 Corinthians addresses many practical questions dividing the church. Questions concerning such things as spiritual gifts, marriage, food offered to idols, and the resurrection. Paul urged the Corinthians to be unified and to give themselves fully to the work of the Lord. 1558.
Yeah, and we were talking before about just 1 Corinthians, how it's filled with like contentions and conflicts.
Yeah, I think really Paul is just earnestly writing to this church that he spent so much time with, and they are floundering, and what's happening in their floundering is they're just having so much conflict and infighting and contentions and divisions over so many issues.
Yeah, and like in chapter 11, when talking about the head coverings, even he says, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. And we'll see in here just the emphasis upon unity. And even as Phil Smith came to our church about 10 days ago, and he preached about 1 and 2 Corinthians and spoke about the importance of humility for the church.
Yeah, and I just think that is all throughout this letter, and the flip side of it, pride.
Yeah.
You know, Paul confronts their arrogance. He confronts their wanting prominence, holding on to their rights, all of those prideful issues that are leading to conflict.
Yeah, I've not preached through 1 Corinthians yet, but I have thought about calling it First Americans, just because it is so typical of the churches in America.
Yeah, we're not immune to this at all.
Not
maybe
at all.
It's some different issues, but maybe some of the same issues.
Right, and the solution to the contentions and conflicts would be, like Paul says, he gives up his rights. And he'd rather be wronged than to try to stand his ground. He says it in chapter 6. And when talking about the spiritual gifts, he says, do what's best to the building up of the church.
Right.
And just remember the gospel, right? Freely you've been forgiven, so freely give, so the church can walk together in unity. And everything that God gives is for the common good. It's not for tearing down.
Right. And I think he also talks very much about how much better love is than knowledge. Love is better than spiritual gifts, especially the prominent spiritual gifts, because knowledge puffs up, leads to pride.
Right.
The prominent gifts lead to pride.
Right.
And love is far better.
Right. Okay, so let's just talk about it. We got 16 chapters here, and they're split right in half. So the first 6 chapters are talking about
problems and solutions.
Yep. And then in chapters 7 through 16, we have
questions and answers.
And you asked me before, like, what's the difference between a problem, solution, and question and answer? Because they're really the same thing.
Right.
I think, though, the difference comes in chapter 7, verse 1, that the questions and answers are coming from the Corinthians. They have questions.
Right, because he says, now concerning this.
Yeah, concerning the matters about which you wrote in chapter 7, verse 1. So this is called 1 Corinthians, but it's actually at least 2 Corinthians, because there was another letter that Paul refers to that they had asked these questions. And the question and answer, I think, are the issues that the Corinthians brought up that Paul is answering. I think the problems and solutions are the sorts of things that Paul is putting his fingers on. Like, these are problems. You're not even raising them, but these are problems that you got to deal with in these ways. So it's like all problem, solution, question and answer, all the same thing, but it's like, who brought up the issue?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so let's just work through, first of all, the problems and solutions. These are the ones that Paul brought up in the first 6 chapters.
So this is 1 through 6.
Yep.
Okay, so chapter 1, we're going to kind of organize it in problems and solutions. So the problem
What's
would
the problem
be
in chapter 1?
Divisions.
Yeah.
And then the solution is remember your calling.
Yeah.
I mean, remember the gospel.
Yeah.
You've been called to reflect Christ.
Yeah, and just remember how you came from nothing. God didn't choose the wise.
Right.
Verse 26, he didn't choose the powerful. He chose the weak. So let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Like, if you're boasting in the Lord, you're not going to have divisions. But divisions come when you boast in yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, and then chapter 2.
So the problem is human wisdom, and the solution is spiritual wisdom.
Yeah, and spiritual wisdom comes in the gospel. Human wisdom comes in just other things, thinking what they think is right. But that's why Paul said in chapter 2, verse 2, I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Like that is spiritual wisdom, is it comes, the gospel solves everything. Okay, and then chapter 3.
So the problem is carnality, so fleshliness.
Yeah, arguing in the flesh about who they're following and just how good they are. There's jealousy and strife is what it speaks about in verse 3, and the solution to that.
And that is, but God causes the growth.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of Galatians 5, and just the deeds of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit.
Yes,
and so
very much so. Okay, and then chapter 4.
The problem is the Corinthians' pride.
Yeah. In fact, it says in chapter 4, verse 6, that none of you may be puffed up in favor against one another. Verse 7, what do you have that you did not receive? Like, everything that we have is a gift from God. And so pride is the problem. And what's the solution?
Apostolic humility.
Yeah.
So the humility of the apostles, like
so it's
Paul.
interesting. He's not calling you be humble. He just demonstrated his own humility. And how should you consider us? Chapter 4, verse 1. We are servants of Christ.
Or verse 10, we are fools for Christ's sake.
We're just bending. We're just like, who are we?
Giving up their rights.
Okay. In chapter 5, then, what's the problem?
The problem is sexual immorality.
In the church. And so,
in the church, and they are celebrating it.
Yeah. I mean, this is totally like the LGBT celebrating that. This is exactly what that is. Churches who celebrate
saying,
that.
we're so loving.
Yeah, we're so open. And they were boasting about it. And yet, what's the solution to that?
To purge and cleanse their church.
Yeah, and the picture there is given of like leaven. And that the leaven goes, now get that leaven out of there, because a little leaven spoils the whole lump of the dough. So,
and I mean, even calling them in verse 12 to judge those inside the church, like discipline.
Yep. Okay, in chapter 6, what are the problems?
The problem is they're seeking lawsuits against each other.
Okay.
They can't agree, and they're going to secular courts to iron things out.
And what's the solution there?
Just let yourselves be wronged. Verse 7, why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded?
Yeah, okay, so lawsuits is a problem, and then there's another problem here.
And then also sexual sin, again. And the solution is to flee.
Yeah,
verse 18.
Yep, that's good. Okay, so those are the problems and solutions he's bringing up. It's not good. It's divisions in the church. There's boasting in their smartness, their own human wisdom, and they're carnal, and they're proud, and they're proud of their immorality. I mean, how much we hear about gay pride nowadays. Their lawsuits are happening, and he's just trying to correct them to get them on the right path. It sounds like an awful church.
Yeah, I mean, I just think of how discouraged he must be. He started this church and poured 18 months of his life into living there among them, and just to see them collapsing like this must have been very discouraging.
Okay, and now we have questions and answers. And so he says, oftentimes in these chapters, now concerning these things, chapter 8, verse 1, now concerning food offered to idols, is what he says. And then he says, chapter 12, verse 1, now concerning spiritual gifts. And then he says, chapter 16, verse 1, now concerning the collection of the saints. I think they were collection for the saints. I think they were just asking these questions. And he said, okay, I'm going to answer these questions. So chapter 7 is...
Okay, so the issue he's addressing is marriage and singleness.
Yep. And basically says, get married if you lack self-control. And marriage isn't bad, but if you can be single, boy, be single, because you'll be freed up to serve the Lord. That's sort of the thrust of things.
Like he is.
Like he is, yes.
Right.
Okay, and then chapters 8, 9, and 10 all deal with the same issue. And they deal with
They're
what?
dealing with the issue of food offered to idols, but then he addresses some underlying issues with that. And in 8, he deals with just that knowledge must yield to love.
Yeah, because we see in verse 1 how knowledge puffs up. And you can, in your knowledge, can know that, hey, food sacrificed to idols is really nothing. And so I can eat it, but others who don't have that knowledge, then you destroy them. And so just beware that knowledge needs to yield in love for someone else. You might know what's right, but just yield in love so that they're not offended. And that carries over then to chapter 9, because in chapter 9, he's not talking about food sacrificed to idols, but he's the principle of the gospel here. And what's the principle?
Right. So the principle is surrender your rights for the sake of the gospel.
Yeah. That's what Paul said. Like, I can get married, but I chose not to.
Right, and he's modeling that of
Yeah.
giving up his rights for
Yeah.
the sake of the gospel.
I could be
He's
paid.
free.
Yeah, I could be paid to get the gospel, but I'm not. I'm giving that up. And he's talked about his right several times. He talks about it in verse 12. We've not made use of this right, the right to be paid for preaching the gospel. He says, we just given it up. Verse 15, I have made no use of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure such a provision. He says, I'm giving up my rights for the sake of the gospel. And he says then, for the sake of that, chapter 9, verse 20, just doing all things to be a servant that I might win some. To the Jews, I became a Jew. Right? To those outside of the law, to the Gentiles, I became like a Gentile. That all ways I might win some. And how does he win people? He wins people by bending. And I think that has to do a little bit how he's going to run the race. He's going to run the race and bending however he can. Okay, and then chapter 10 continues this theme about food sacrificed to idols, mostly about idols, though.
Right, and he uses Israel as an example to show them the evils of idolatry.
Yeah, twice he speaks about them as examples.
Yeah.
Chapter 10, verse 6, these things about the Jews bowing to idolatry proves as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. Chapter 10, verse 11, these things happened to them as an example. What happened? They're pursuing idolatry and how bad it was. And so the conclusion, Paul says, therefore, verse 14,
Flee.
Flee from idolatry. Just do it all. Just flee from it.
Yeah, flee from idolatry.
Yep. Okay, and so that was chapters 8 through 10, talking about food sacrificed to idols, and it spilled over to idolatry. Because just bend, is what he said.
And then I think 10 wraps up that whole section really well with verses 24 and 31, saying, do all to the glory of God.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, like verse 24, do good for his neighbor. And 31, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, the food sacrifice, do it all to the glory of God. So always seek to live.
Or seek others good and seek the glory of God above all else.
Okay, and then chapters 11 through 14 are dealing with what issue there?
So gatherings, but contentions that they're having in the midst of their gatherings.
Yeah. Like, it's really, so we kind of looked at this beforehand, just the amount of fighting going on here, and there's contentions back and forth.
Every chapter.
So he first in chapter 11 talks about two issues. He talks about
head coverings and the Lord's Supper. Yeah,
with head coverings, we don't even know what this is. It's very difficult to understand. But at the end of the day, it's verse 15. 16, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, there's no such practice in the churches of God. So don't be contentious over this issue or other issues. And the Lord's Supper, there was contentions and divisions as well, because some were eating first, some were eating second, and they were, it wasn't a joyous unity feast. It was a disunifying thing. It was really bad.
Right.
Okay, and then chapter 12 deals with what?
Deals with spiritual gifts.
Yeah.
And so they are having contentions about spiritual gifts and which ones are more prominent and who wants to have the more prominent gifts. And they're they're just fighting over it. And so he says the solution is just seek the common good, like verse 7. Like that's what these gifts are for. It's to build one another up. And
this is a famous passage in chapter 12 where it says, the whole body isn't a hand. That'd be no good. No body's an eye. Like everybody just plays their function and plays their role. Why? To build up the body. God gives, the Spirit gives us gifts, verse 7, for the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. And the gifts are given for the good of everybody, not just for yourself. Okay, and then chapter 13?
That is the supremacy of love, but I think showing that love is greater than even the most prominent gifts.
Yep. So why love is so crucial to the church.
And they are not manifesting the characteristics of love, like in verses 4 through 7.
Yeah. Chapter 14 has to do with what?
That is about using gifts to build up.
Yeah, it's the use of gifts is what it is. And the gifts need to be used to build, not chaos, not tearing down, not selfishly, but use it to build.
It's especially focusing on the gifts of prophecy and tongues.
Yep.
So, which would be more prominent gifts, and they were distorting those.
Yep. Okay, in chapter 15, we have the one issue is
Resurrection.
the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection of our
believers.
bodies. But it speaks about how crucial this is to the gospel. And really,
Right.
1 Corinthians is all about the gospel. I preach Christ and Him crucified is the only thing I determine to know against you. But what is the gospel, right? We've been forgiven freely. We ought to forgive freely. We ought to not live contentiously as we gather together.
Right. I would remind you of the gospel. This is of first importance.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, chapter 16 says, now concerning the collection for the saints, which is really a subset of the travel plans. He says, I'm going to come, you collect these things, and then he gets into all these other plans of Apollos wants to come, but he doesn't have an opportunity yet, but all these other households and when they're coming, and how you need to greet one another with a holy kiss.
Right. He's just wrapping up all the loose ends.
Yep. And that is 1 Corinthians, and it's a great book, great instruction for us as the American church. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow in 2 Corinthians.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.